you're on a boss fight where the boss disappears for exactly 1.5 seconds. Now, if you have no alacrity at all, you are missing out on exactly one GCD. Okay, that's kind of devastating, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Now let's imagine that you have more alacrity. Let's imagine that you have non-zero alacrity. Your GCD is shorter now. Your GCD is maybe 1.4 seconds or like 1.35 seconds. Now suddenly that 1.5-second gap is worth not just one GCD, but like 1 and maybe 10% of a GCD or 1 and 20% of a GCD. Like just it's worth more time relative to your kind of weird alacrity buffed part of the universe than it was before. And so it's multiplicative in its value loss in terms of latency and downtime and mistakes and all of that stuff. It's a very punishing stat.
So does that imply, because you're saying it also has to do with latency and everything else, or even like how your computer is managing the information and whatnot, if you've got the best computer and the best connection and you're living next door to the BioWare server, does that mean that alacrity is actually going to have a higher value for you?
Yes, very slightly higher value.
Okay. Relative to somebody who doesn't have those
circumstances. Right. Relative to somebody like me that's living on the East Coast and working with a West Coast server.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And variability of your connection actually matters a lot more than your raw latency, right? So you're on a West Coast server, but you probably have a fairly stable connection. So, you're always hitting that like 100, 120 millisecond latency mark, and it's very, very stable at that. So there you just use ability queuing and, the action queue, and you still can get the same sort of responsiveness out of the game engine. Someone who's on a connection that varies from 40 milliseconds to 150 milliseconds randomly and unpredictably, they can't use ability action queuing to the same degree. And they're the ones who are penalized by alacrity.
Okay. Yeah, because my connection is actually generally very, very steady, so that actually means that the queuing works better. Mm-hmm. Did not know that. Okay.
So, generally speaking, alacrity is good, more attractive than it was previously, and I think we're still at the front edge of learning about all of its great things.
Okay, so now just to touch rapidly on the fact that alacrity has been significantly changed and increased in value, it sounds like, except for certain exceptions, in which case it's really devastating. Do you have examples beyond I/O for when it's devastating? Deception.
So there's an interesting philosophy that BioWare put forward, which is that alacrity was not going to reduce the cooldown on defensive buffs, right? And this is because they specifically wanted to avoid making alacrity valuable for tanks. So, I mean, imagine if you could stack a whole bunch of alacrity as a tank and make your overcharged saber come off cooldown that much faster. Yeah. Or conversely, imagine if you stacked a whole bunch of alacrity and all of a sudden your saber reflect didn't last as long. That would really suck, right? So they basically just made all of those effects exempt. Here is the problem. Force Cloak, so the combat stealth for Assassins and Shadows, is counted as a defensive buff. So the debuff that you get from Force Cloak, or rather the buff now, because it doesn't have a debuffing effect, but the buff that you get that makes you like super stealthy, that's not shortened by alacrity. And the cooldown on Force Cloak is also not shortened by alacrity. Here's the issue. If you're a Deception Assassin, Force Cloak is also an offensive buff. It's a very, very important offensive buff because it removes cooldown time on your recklessness and it increases your force regen. So you have to use it on cooldown. You want to be able to use it at a similar point in your rotation every time. And the rotation as it stands times out really, really well for that if you have no alacrity. If you have alacrity, then you'll find once every 90 seconds, Force Cloak is no longer in the same point in your rotation that it was the last time. And it actually makes the whole thing crumble into pieces.
Okay, so cool. And which one is I/O? Is that middle tree or right tree?
The right one. Although it's not really right anymore. Yeah, it was previously Pyrotech.
I don't know, I guess.
Yeah. It's the bottom of the drop.
Right, or is dang, that's right.
It's Assault Specialist on pub side.
Okay, yeah, does that apply then also for the
Vanguard and
Pyrotech, yeah.
Not to the same degree.
Yeah. The Vanguard and Pyrotech trees that have the similar proc on Railshot would be Advanced Prototype and Tactics. And they do get affected by alacrity, and especially temporary alacrity buffs, but it's not it's not as punishing simply because their ammo is not punishing.
Okay.
Tactics and AP have a much more forgiving rotation than IO and Assault. So while it affects them, it doesn't destroy their livelihood.
Okay. So, so then these anecdotal stories I've heard. I've got a guildie who plays Madness or whatever dot spec is for the Sork. That's
Is that hatred now or something?
yeah. I think he
Or that's
said
the
he
assassin,
took out
right?
his
That's
primary
the
stat
assassin, yeah.
augments and put in his alacrity augments and saw his DPS spike significantly. I think he said 200 or 300 DPS.
That would be probably anecdotal and not sufficiently tested. So I did. The math doesn't support that outcome. It says that maybe you could get it once in a while if you get lucky, right? So if you're just like parse once with primary stat augments, parse once with alacrity augments. Ooh, the alacrity augments are better. Well, check the rest of your parse, like Oofalong was saying.
Right.
But I did some really, really extensive testing of this on the PTS, specifically with Sorks. And alacrity augments were fun. It was great to have an APM of like 51 as a caster, but it was lower DPS in every single, like the lower averages just across the board. So
Can you
math,
clarify-
math says no and testing says no.
Okay, so actually clarify something that's coming out of the chat room right now. So for dots, as they're affected by alacrity, they tick faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does the duration of the dot, is that shorter?
Yes.
Okay, so you reapply it more often, but it's getting all of its ticks in more often.
Yep.
Okay.
A good example of where this actually has a fantastic result is if you play a marksmanship sniper, you have corrosive dart in rotation, right? And pre 3.0, corrosive dart used to drift relative to your GCD just a little bit because you're hitting sniper volley on cooldown, right? So sniper volley happens and all of a sudden you have faster GCDs and things come off cooldown faster and blah, blah, blah. And you're like in the middle of casting your ambush and then all of a sudden corrosive dart falls off the target. So you have to reapply it at like this really awkward time and you have downtime and sometimes you have to think about clipping. It was really bad. Now, because the dot ticks faster and because the duration is shortened by sniper volley whenever you hit it, corrosive dart lands at exactly the precise GCD alignment every single time, barring mistakes and barring that rounding error that we were talking about. But it lands at exactly the precise point between the GCDs every time. So the rotation feels more cohesive than it used to.
Okay, and so anyway, the alacrity itself now has been tremendously changed again with 3.0 because it impacts more of the game mechanics in the game. However, the calculation for percent alacrity change based off of alacrity rating has not changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not really. I guess the only change to any of the stat calculations is all of the nonlinear elements utilize your level, so your current level. So holding all else constant, as you level up from 55 to 60, your stats will go down slightly for all of your stats. So it effectively hasn't changed, but there's technically it did change, but it really did not change in effect.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
it's not like going from 2.0 to 3.0 where your stats just like crater.
right. Well, and crit,
sorry,
crit
1.0
in
to
particular
2.0.
cut in half.
Yeah.
But so I guess then I have a big question for the two of you. If the math hasn't really changed, other than the fact that within those equations, instead of being level 55, you're now level 60. Why is it that they said that we've had a tremendous reduction in DPS numbers overall? How did they pull that off?
Right, so I think that's a really good question. One of the points out there is we needed to look at where your damage came from, what contributors there are to your damage. So your stats are certainly one element of that. They're a big part of it, without a doubt. The other thing that makes a big difference is in your talent tree and now in your discipline track. You have a variety of talents or abilities that will boost the damage or boost the critical chance or boost the surge of one or more of your primary abilities. In many cases, there's an exact copy in name and in tooltip and everything else from the skill tree world to the talent to the discipline world. But what's different now is that the magnitude of those buffs have been reduced. So previously you might have had something that increased your surge by for a force scream or something, by like 30%, and maybe that's down to only increasing it by 10% now. Or maybe previously you had something that increased your critical chance by 6%, and now that's only increasing it by 3%. So every one of those individual talents, or in many cases, those talents have been what they have done to reduce the damage that your class does. The other thing, once you have all of your stats calculated, you actually have to run through individual equations for each ability used. And in many cases, those ability calculations have changed. So there's coefficients specific to each ability, and many of those coefficients changed as well. So there's those two other factors, individual damage or ability calculations, as well as the magnitude of the buffs provided by your skill tree / discipline track now that drove the changes.
Okay. So that makes sense. So that makes it easier for you guys when we're talking about gear contribution towards these stats and how they affect us. Those still have not been changed. But there is a reevaluation for all of the new disciplines because of how they actually impact how the disciplines are played.
Well, there's something very subtle here, actually, that is worth talking about because it's interesting from a theoretical standpoint and it has some practical implications. And that is, okay, so the value of stats haven't changed aside from the level coefficient, which kind of reduces the value of all of the stats just a little bit across the board, right? But it's uniform. All of the stats got reduced by kind of the same flat amount because you're going from a coefficient of 55 to a coefficient of 60. Okay, right? That's the stat change. Here's what is really interesting. By flattening all of the stats across the board, you actually make some of the relative values between the stats closer. And that pushes up some of the relative values by a surprising amount. So in tanking, for example, the relative value of defense is actually higher than it was before. So defense is more interesting for the tanks than it was in 2.0, just because all of the stats have been squished down. And so you start seeing some effects that get pushed up in a nonlinear fashion by that. Another example of this is crit. Crit is a little bit closer to the value of power than it used to be, and certainly closer to the value of other things that it can compete with. And so you end up seeing that becoming a little bit more interesting, or at least the effects of it being a little bit more subtle and a lot less pronounced than they used to be. So there's still best in slot stuff, and there's still things like that, but some things have been squished down, and that has resulted in some very interesting effects in places.
Cool. Oofalong, did you have anything further?
No, it's a good point. Good point to consider the relative value of each thing as it changes. I didn't realize that defense was better now too, or at least comparatively speaking, better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's other things that weighed into that, like some of the shield and absorb talents were changed a little bit with 3.0, similar to what you were talking about with the surge talents. But just across the board, it really, really is better than it was by several hundred points in places, which is quite surprising to me.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Actually, along that thread concerning tank stats, is there a universal starting point for tanks, which defensive stat they should use? Or, sorry, because not defense, but which tank stat they should use, say, defense or shield or absorb, for augmenting when they're just starting out at max cap? Or is it still...
It's dynamically different in a sense because augments are the only gear slot where you can trade every stat against every other stat. So in particular, augments give you the ability to trade defense for shield, and that's really, really special. But I realize everyone has to start somewhere, right? And everybody's starting at kind of a low tier of gear, and we're gonna push up through that, and we don't want to change our augments too much as we go along because it's very expensive. What I would recommend from class to class is as follows. Number one, if you're a Juggernaut or a Guardian tank, you should probably just augment for defense and make up the rest of your stat budget by swapping mods and enhancements down the road. That's probably going to be pretty accurate. Maybe you're going to have to swap a defense augment for like a shield or an absorb augment later on, but it seems unlikely. And if you're doing that level of min-maxing, you probably already know all of this. If you are a power tech tank, power techs for the very, very first time in the game actually want to just straight up augment for shield. As you get to the higher tiers of gear, some of those shield augments turn into absorb augments, but right now, augmenting for shield is not going to hurt you. So that's where I would start if I was a power tech or vanguard tank. Just throw a whole bunch of shield augments in there, make up the difference with your enhancements and your mods. And bear in mind that the new tier